Cooperative Vermont. We're coming to you live from VCAM Studios this Sunday, February 10th, 2013. I'm Matthew Cropp.
And I'm Eric Davis.
And we've got a pretty, I think, solid show lined up this evening. Where we've got in the studio for an interview Avram Patt of the Washington Electric Co-op. He's the general manager and kind of has a long history with the co-op movement, which we're excited to be able to dig into. But before we go into that, we're going to have a few updates about the latest news in the Vermont cooperative movement. To start with, the Granite City Grocery Project, the startup food co-op in Barrie, has been continuing to make what seems like pretty steady progress. They're nearing the 400 pledges mark, and they need 600 before they call in the pledges to actually really start the co-op in earnest. And number 350 was actually Governor Shumlin, so it's kind of, they seem to be having these continuing sort of moments of public exposure that are then bringing more people into the fold. So that's a pretty exciting project to be watching, and hopefully we'll have Emily Kaminsky on here on the show eventually to talk about what that looks like on the ground. But one other thing that they've also implemented is a kids club. So kind of one more way of bringing people in, but getting children of people who are interested in the co-op together on a regular basis, and sort of just as one more mode of outreach. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And in other cooperative development news, the Keep Burlington Telecom Local campaign is continuing. They've surpassed the 30% goal of pledge amount, and they're at 32% right now. And also the ongoing negotiations with the city capital has been sort of extended. So there's more time to pledge to keep our telecom local if you haven't already.
And there's also some good outreach and a good example of cooperation among cooperatives going on. The City Market has been continuing to put out updates on the project in their newsletter, and on any days in which there's no food demos, they've been allowing volunteers from the co-op project to use that demo space to hand out information. So good example of co-ops cooperating.
Right, and more news of co-ops really honoring that sixth principle there is the Energy Co-op of Vermont. Avram, you just mentioned that you were involved in the inception of that, kicking off their solar hot water program again for the year, and VSCCU is providing a lot of the financing to meet certain gaps for individuals in that program. So it's another story of cooperatives, coming together.
Yeah, and I feel like that's kind of a big interesting one because of all the co-ops that I'm aware of, or the co-op sectors, it seems like the credit unions are the ones that seem most to sort of silo themselves off as their own thing, rather than sort of really reaching out to other co-ops in other sectors. So it's always really cool to see a credit union like VSCCU kind of going to another co-op and saying, "Hey, let's work on this project together."
Absolutely.
And one other thing, this is down in Massachusetts, but it's in cooperation with the Cooperative Fund of New England. Is the Valley Alliance of Worker Co-ops in Mass has established a loan fund. And this is really interesting because it kind of follows a model similar to some other worker co-op networks in other parts of the world where they have a revolving fund. So all of the worker co-ops involved have committed to putting 5% of their annual profits into this fund that will then, the goal of being sort of providing funds for member co-ops to expand and also funds to provide support to startup worker co-ops. So it'll be really interesting to see how that model works and develops, and if that's something that we might be able to replicate in Vermont. But that could be a big source of kind of continuing capital for growing the cooperative economy if it pans out well for them.
It's interesting to see all these efforts happening, in different places across different sorts of co-ops. It's really exciting.
And then also in terms of new food co-op startups, obviously not as far along as the Granite City Grocery one, but in Morrisville there's a survey out now of people sort of in the area trying to get a gauge of the level of support and kind of what people would want to see from a co-op in Morrisville.
And folks can access that survey on our Facebook page. It's posted on there, and check it out if you're in the Morrisville area and like a place to get a good nutritious meal and local food. Check it out.
Okay, and then finally is the upcoming conference. Do you want to talk a little bit about that?
Sure. So Cooperative Vermont is part of a group of organizations that were awarded a grant by the New Economics Institute, and we're organizing a track based around cooperatives, particularly bringing students into the cooperative movement. We'll be having a panel discussion at UVM on April 17th. It's a Wednesday, bringing together folks from credit union industry, agricultural co-ops, energy co-ops,
worker co-ops,
and
then also food co-ops, I think.
Okay,
is the goal. So like those 5 kind of probably the biggest sort of co-op sectors in Vermont,
and sort of introducing the state of the Vermont cooperative economy and touching on sort of where it might be able to go from here. And we're working on the keynote for the conference, which hopefully we'll know about soon. And there are some really big names involved in that conversation.
Yeah. Big names in the world of new economy and co-ops, anyway.
Right.
But yeah, and then sort of also at that April 27th conference, we'll be sort of having a co-op track in which we'll be doing kind of a morning session on sort of envisioning what a co-op economy can look like, and then an afternoon track on really the nuts and bolts of what work is going on in Vermont and how people who are interested can get involved. So if there's anyone out there who this is something that you dig, definitely keep your eye out for updates as the details kind of fall into place. But with that, I think that pretty much covers the news since the last episode.
Yeah.
So again, Avram, welcome to the program.
Thanks for inviting me here. Looking forward to our conversation.
So to start us off, can you tell us a little bit about you're the general manager of the Washington Electric Co-op. Kind of how did you first get involved in the world of cooperation?
I got involved in the world of cooperatives by growing up in a neighborhood in the Bronx in New York where I grew up, which is called the Amalgamated, and it's the nation's first housing co-op. And I grew up there, and it's now it's celebrating its 85th anniversary, and although housing co-ops are not that prevalent, they exist, but they're not that prevalent elsewhere. In New York City, it's a big piece of affordable housing. This neighborhood has 1,500 apartments, and people from the Amalgamated went on to build some of the much larger and more prominent housing co-ops in the city, like Co-op City in the East Bronx and Rochdale Village in Queens, and the co-ops in Lower Manhattan and in the Chelsea neighborhood of Manhattan. And this was a neighborhood at the time that had a co-op grocery store, credit union, and that was and educational programs, and it was really, in addition to just providing apartments, affordable, decent apartments that people actually owned a piece of. It was a neighborhood with a lot of common interests and community and educational programs for kids, older people, and all of that. It was originally founded, it's called the Amalgamated because it was founded out of the Amalgamated Clothing Workers Union. At the time, it was almost entirely Jewish trade union members that founded it back in those days. And over the years, and as generations have come and gone, the demographics of the neighborhood are much different now, and a much more diverse and mixed population. And I think the board and management of that place has done an astonishing job at educating people about being active in the co-op and what being, my sister still lives there, and so when I visit, I did a week ago, it's, in some ways it's a very different neighborhood. The people look different in a lot of ways. I read the stuff on the bulletin boards, and it's the same neighborhood it ever was. So I grew up just very kind of, I was born and bred that way. And when I got to Vermont in the early 70s and bought my first little cabin in 1973, I discovered that the utility was a co-op, and I didn't know that there were utilities that were co-ops. I knew there were housing and food co-ops, and so that was just, there were, at the time, people were organizing and trying to make some changes at Washington Electric Co-op, and although I was not in on the beginning of that, I got drawn into that eventually, and ended up.
What sort of changes were they trying to make?
There were a number of things, but the main issues at the time were where we got our power from, and the co-op board at that time had taken steps that would have been disastrous in the end to buy into the Seabrook nuclear plant. And a group of people organized primarily to try to break the co-op out of that, which they succeeded in, to start looking for new sources of power, although it took years before we had the opportunity to do that, but to also put a real emphasis on energy efficiency and conservation, which at the time, if you were in the utility business, that simply meant selling less of your product, and why would any business, co-op or otherwise, want to do that? There were also management issues. The co-op over the years, I think, had been not well run in the end, and so there were people who were concerned about that. So I served on the board for 8 years before I became manager, and the year that I got elected to the board actually was the year that the majority flipped between the old guard and the new guard. And although we still had a few years of controversy with a split board, with a 5-4 board, when feelings are strong, it's not easy.
So what did can you maybe talk a little bit about what that process of moving from the old guard to the new guard looked like? Was it what was the membership divided? Kind of like what was the
there were people who began organizing, who were at the time outside dissidents, and there were the management and board at the time really tried to shut those people out and cut them off. But there were what I called a number of years of vigorous exercise of the democratic process. People organized. They used the election process. They reached out. We're a co-op that serves people in 41 towns, going all the way from parts of the Northeast Kingdom down to Tunbridge and Chelsea. So people had to reach out and find people with similar concerns in different parts of the state, actually, and cross the divides between some of the newcomer Flatlander Vermonters that were involved in this and some of multi-generational old-time Vermonters that were involved, some of them whose families had been involved in founding Washington Electric Co-op. So it was really an organized election effort. Identify your voters, get out the vote, make some noise. And there were the other side organized. Once you have a faction that's organizing, the other side got organized too. So it was an interesting few years.
And what? So it sounds like the Seabrook and the sort of source of power was the major issue, or were there other issues too?
I think Seabrook was the big galvanizing issue because it was so prominent. Because there were some people who were very passionately anti-nuclear, and that's an emotional issue. So it gets people going. Whereas matters of financial management or some things like that are harder to get people aroused about. Also, at the time, energy efficiency was not. People didn't even understand what that was or how to do it. In the early days, before efficient light bulbs and efficient refrigerators, using less electricity meant freezing in the dark, or that's what people thought. And it took a while before we got to the point where we said, no, it means doing what you need to do, but using a lot less energy to do it. And that was a hard thing for people to grasp, but people did understand nuclear power, and a lot of people understood that they didn't like it, so that was the real organizing focus.
So then you were elected kind of the moment that the board flipped, you said.
Yes. Yeah.
And then you served on the board for 8 years.
8
and
years.
What was that transition from you being a board member to becoming the general manager?
The person that after a year or so of the majority of the board having changed, the manager that we installed, our majority installed, decided to move on, and I had been in state government. I had been managing programs in state government. I had management experience and decided that I might be interested in doing that, and so that I got appointed to that, and I actually discovered in talking to other co-op managers around the country that that's almost unheard of, to go from the board to management, but it was the right time and place, I think, for the co-op and for me. That was the time, this was in the late 1990s, the utility industry in Vermont and nationally and in New England was moving at the time towards retail competition. Vermont did not go that way, but for a while it actually looked like Vermont would be the first New England state to do that. And so I think the feeling among the members of the board who hired me at that time was that the co-op did not even know what business we were going to be in a few years. And so the kind of manager that was needed at that time was someone more with a strategic and political outlook and experience, which I had, and less from a traditional utility poles and wires engineering background, which I did not have. And fortunately, there are plenty of people at the co-op when I came in that knew how to keep people's lights on.
And so, so you had been elected to the board. You'd spent a number of years on the board, and then sort of this opportunity emerged. And was how were you received in the organization, like amongst the employees, like in that transition? Were you well known, and was it easy? Were there some growing pains?
I don't think so. I came in having worked in other organizations, and I knew the people, although I hadn't worked with them as as a fellow employee. So I don't think that there were real issues of me coming in. I was a known entity. I actually remember a question from a board member wondering whether I thought I might be perceived by the employees as being sort of too close to the board. And I answered that. I said, "Look, I'll be there for about a week, and I'm going to be an employee." I was like, I don't see that as an issue. I've been around organizations long enough that I really understood the sort of lines and boundaries and that kind of thing.
So you didn't go into the general manager position with a lot of background in the nuts and bolts of engineering, electrical engineering, but I'm sure now you've had many years of experience in that.
I know more than I used to.
You're the first person we've had on the show from a utility cooperative, and I was wondering if you could just sort of speak to how an electrical cooperative works, and maybe to some of the roots of the co-op movement.
Well, like I said earlier, having grown up in the city, I had no idea where Con Ed was this sort of faceless utility. I had no idea that a utility could be a co-op, and the reason is that the electric co-ops in this country are rural electric co-ops. There are still about 900 of them around the country, ranging in size from, we have 10,600 meters. There are some that are smaller than us. There are some that are much larger than us. There are some that with 100,000 or 150,000 members. But all of the electric co-ops were formed during the New Deal era in the Roosevelt administration, starting in the 30s and into the 40s. And the Rural Electrification Administration was designed, the problem at the time was that the countryside throughout this country and states all across the country, including Vermont, but the rest of the country as well, the rural areas did not have electricity, or large parts of the rural areas did not, which meant that they were held back from the progress. Farms being able to use electricity, refrigeration for milk, all of the kind of things that we now take for granted, industry and business, employment, everything. And it was simply a matter of economics. The investor-owned utilities had, in Vermont, pretty much stopped wiring, extending lines around 1920. Because it made no sense for them from a business point of view. From their perspective, I understand that. They needed to make a profit, and at a certain density, you can't do that anymore. It doesn't work. And that was happening across the whole country. And so the Roosevelt administration, after trying to give financial incentives and financing programs to the investor-owned utilities to extend lines, and they refused, decided to help form co-ops across the country. So Washington Electric Co-op and the other co-op in Vermont, Vermont Electric Co-op, were formed at the same time, VEC in 1938, Washington Electric in 39. It was really to extend lines out past where the investor-owned utilities had stopped. And that's really, that's a history that still unites all of the co-ops around the country, as diverse as we all are in the different states that we're operating in. And the co-op extended lines are what is now our office building in East Montpelier was in 1939 a engine room with 2 Caterpillar diesel engines that generated the power for 200 mostly farm families in Calais and East Montpelier. And over time, the demand was so great. We were originally called Washington County Electric Co-op. And pretty soon we were in Caledonia and Orange County, and they decided the way to deal with that was to just drop the county out of the name. And that's really the demand. The people wanted electricity so badly. There are wonderful stories from our co-op and other co-ops where getting power to the barn and the house was literally a near religious experience for people. It was the most amazing thing in their lives. People wept. There's a story in our archives of a woman describing driving up the county road that runs between East Montpelier and Calais, and lights were on, and people were playing music for the cows in the barn. I mean, it was just people at the time didn't want to turn their lights off. It was just, it was just an amazing change for people. So that's the history of the co-ops. And on a day-to-day basis, we're an electric utility. We have poles and wires. We have technical staff, a billing department, and do what a utility does. But we're owned by the members, by the consumers. They elect the board of directors, and that makes a difference in how we run and some of the decisions we make.
So one thing I'm kind of curious to hear a little bit about is, you have this unique history of that's probably pretty rare amongst most electric co-ops of having had this dissident campaign amongst the members actually sort of change the composition of the board and gain a majority. How has that made sort of the Washington Electric Co-op different than, or set it apart from other electric co-ops around the country? Like, what are the sort of policy or other things that?
I think, first of all, I mean, we're not alone in this, but I would say our environmental concern and what we've done about it, starting first with energy efficiency and then in changing our power supply as we started to have opportunities for that towards renewable and cleaner sources, is not unique. But there are lots of co-ops in Texas and Oklahoma, and where it's hard for them to, and co-ops that are heavily invested in nuclear power for a variety of historical reasons. It's very hard for them to get out of these long-term investments and change their mind. On the other hand, there are co-ops. There's a group of co-ops in Minnesota that are getting 30% of their power from wind projects that they themselves developed. So there are real examples, but I think we've kind of stood out in the electric co-op community nationally for our early interest in energy efficiency when that was not. Other co-ops didn't understand what we were talking about. They do now. They're very actively involved in energy efficiency now, to their credit, and have formed national co-op organizations to help small co-ops do that in places where they don't have things like Efficiency Vermont, like we have in Vermont. We've on particularly environmental and power supply issues at the national level, we've tried to play a role in pushing our national association and other co-ops a little bit our way, a little bit of success. We are a minority on those issues among the majority of electric co-ops. But
I was really, really impressed to see how much of Washington Electric's power was renewable. And I was wondering if you could speak to sort of how that transition happened in the portfolio, and we've talked about the democratic process, and if there were any tensions among membership during that, or
I'll start by saying there are, without getting into the debate now, there are different definitions of renewable.
Sure.
And for instance, Vermont statute recognizes large hydro as renewable, Hydro-Quebec, or some of the very large projects in upstate New York, which is not universally considered renewable, although a lot of people will say it's cleaner than some other options, but it's not renewable because of very large environmental impact in flooding huge areas like that. And the other issue is that for some of our newer renewables in our mix, we are, at least at this time, selling the renewable energy certificates in states where there are renewable mandates, and making money, which goes back to our members. And so I'll mention a couple of our sources which are renewable energy, but when we make a pie chart of our sources, that's where we're getting our energy from, but we don't call it renewable in our own mix. So in the 1980s, the co-op built a small hydro plant at the Wrightsville Reservoir on the north end of Montpelier. Get a small piece of our power. We own and operate that. We get about 5% of our power. Co-ops and municipals in Vermont have the ability to purchase pretty low-cost hydro from the New York Power Authority. And it's only available to our residential customers by law. We have been getting power from Hydro-Quebec, about 20% of our supply from Hydro-Quebec in the current contract, and we are also participating in the new contract that will be starting in 2016. That was in the news a couple of years ago. But when in 2002, up until then, we had been taking 30% of our supply from Vermont Yankee. We actually were owners. We owned some shares in that plant. And our contract was ending that year. And so in planning for that cliff in our power supply, we started to look for renewables and to see how much we could replace nuclear with renewables. At which point we discovered that you could generate a lot of electricity off of the methane gas coming out of landfills. And we first actually purchased the output from a landfill in Connecticut for a few years while we built a plant at Vermont's largest landfill in Coventry. And that is supplying about 60% of the energy that our members use. And what's different about landfill methane compared to wind or solar is that it's base load. It runs all the time. And so it actually looked like the nuclear power that we were replacing in terms of how it fit into our portfolio. And then most recently we were early supporters of and participants in the first wind project in Sheffield, which was the first large project to go online. Our board decided early on not just that we were interested in wind energy, but that once we had found the project we wanted to affiliate with, that we were really going to stick our necks out in terms of the public debate around wind. So we're now, as of 2012 was the first full year of getting power from that project. It started up in October 2011. So in 2012, it was 9% of our power supply. And like I said, we sell the renewable energy certificates from our Coventry plant and from the Sheffield project, because in our contract, when we purchase the energy, we're also getting the renewable energy certificates that go along with that.
Will that have to be curtailed in the future, given sort of Vermont's targets for renewable energy? We need to sort of keep the renewableness of that sort of energy.
Yes, I mean, in the legislature last year, there was a proposal that did not pass to start a renewable portfolio standard. And frankly, at the co-op, we have always assumed that will happen at some point. And given the fact that we are about 70% of our energy supply now is new renewables that has what we call RECs, renewable energy certificates, that come with it. We're kind of all set. You know, if the law says that at a certain point we have to be 25% renewable, which means not selling them, we already have them. We simply don't sell a certain amount. They'll have a financial and rate impact. That'll be less revenue that we get from that, but we're still going to expect that we'll have a fair amount of revenue from that. So that's been an interesting discussion, because in the sale of the RECs, even for investor-owned, even for Green Mountain Power, that money goes to the ratepayers. That's not someone making a profit on that. That reduces their power costs also at Green Mountain Power. So the debate about, well, it's not, you can't really call it renewable because you're selling the RECs, but on the other hand, you're benefiting Vermont ratepayers by doing that. So there's been a sort of let's ease into let's ease into this, and what is the big harm if people in Massachusetts and Connecticut help our members pay for their investment for a few years So that's.
So
We've been very open about that. The main point is that you can't double count. You can't claim it as renewable if you're selling the RECs, and we've been very careful in explaining that to our members and to the public. And our members get it and are happy to have the revenue help their rates stay down for a few years.
So one thing that you mentioned was in terms of the wind energy thing. You said the co-op has kind of stuck its neck out in terms of supporting wind energy. There's this whole issue of the possible wind moratorium in Vermont, and the co-op board, your co-op's board, voted unanimously to oppose the moratorium. Do you want to talk a little bit about what that was and kind of why that position was taken, how it was unanimous?
The board passed a resolution in early January as the legislative session was starting, opposing a moratorium. But if you read it, and it's on our website, if you read the resolution, it's really, and if you've been following our positions on this, it's really a restatement of policies and positions our board has adopted unanimously for a number of years, but now responding to the specific issue of should there be a moratorium or not. And in our case, to be clear, this is it's a policy decision that our board took. We've got our wind energy. We're not looking for any more because we actually currently have, between the Coventry plant and all our power contracts, we're long. We have more energy contracted than our members are actually using, so we sell little bits of surplus into the New England market. So any of the wind projects that are being talked about for the future, we're simply saying we're not supporting any one particular project. Every project that's proposed goes through a very rigorous environmental review. Not every location is the right location for wind. So we're not supporting this developer or that. We're just saying there shouldn't be a moratorium. We need to have a few more wind projects if we're really going to approach the kind of goals that Vermont has set for itself for renewable electricity. And also, if we are, people talk a lot about, well, why don't we focus on transportation? That's where our real carbon footprint is, which is true, except that one of the primary ways we're going to be changing, hopefully, our carbon footprint in transportation in the next 10, 15 years is electric vehicles. And that's estimated to increase Vermont's electric load by about 30%. If you have one of those cars and drive it a typical number of miles, you'll be using the same number of kilowatt hours as a typical house on an annual basis. And so in our rural area, my wife and I have 2 cars, and they're parked in the driveway, and that's going to be 3 houses worth of load. And our neighbors across the road, same thing. So from a utility point of view, it's not just meeting our current needs and conserving energy. Electricity is going to be play a large part in shifting us away from liquid fossil fuels. But it's only really going to make a difference if the source of the electricity is renewable. If we're just using more natural gas to do that, how much have we accomplished? So the position our board has taken, and that I've been the chief spokesman for several years, is really one in which we're really trying to talk to Vermonters about the trade-offs and choices and the impacts of where we get power from now, which people don't think about. We talked earlier about, well, why don't we just buy more power from Hydro-Quebec? Well, we can, but the Hydro-Quebec has flooded a landmass that's 3 1/3 times the size of Vermont you know, and we're buying some of that power. So I'm not saying we shouldn't, but they have impact. And the other big new source of electricity, or growing source of electricity, and the reason why wholesale market prices are down for at least for a while, is glutton natural gas supply because of fracking in Pennsylvania and upstate New York. So those are, if you don't do this, then you're basically saying, let's stay with the status quo. So let's look at what is the impact of the status quo.
Well, it's interesting because the cooperative model allows the users and the members to sort of have a say in that process.
Yes.
You know, from the debate over Seabrook to the transition to more low carbon, let's call them, energy sources, to taking a policy stance on the wind moratorium. So the cooperative model allows sort of the economic needs of members to sort of have a voice in which direction, you know, they want to go.
It's true. First of all, by law in Vermont, when we built our Coventry project, and we also expanded it twice after it was built. It first went online in 2005. That's the kind of project that gets a certificate of public good from the Vermont Public Service Board, and if the certificate is going to a co-op or a municipal utility, by law there has to be a vote. So we had to educate our members that we were getting out of nuclear power and we were building this landfill methane plant. No one, I mean, at the time, landfill methane, what is that? When we had our grand opening, we had 300 people at the landfill up in Coventry, which I have made the claim that it's the largest public gathering ever on a landfill in Vermont. It probably is. Governor Douglas was there. You know, everybody was there. So that was one sort of, that was not controversial. People had to be educated about what it is, but people love that plant. We do a tour once a year in November, and we get people driving up from all parts of the territory for that. With wind, first of all, we were not, the project we're involved in, we were not the developer of, you know, that's a private company did that. But we, for 6, 7, 8 years, have been very prominently writing about it in our newsletter. It's been talked about at almost all our annual meetings and our fall community meetings. We have members, our membership is pretty much a cross-section of Vermonters. We have members who are strongly opposed to wind. I think that they're in the minority, similar to, you know, Vermont as a whole, but they have come to our meetings, they've spoken, they've brought guests, you know, they've visited our board meetings, they've written in our newsletter, you know, so it's been debated and continues to be. We got our board members and I got a letter from an angry member last week because we had published our resolution in our newsletter and he had read it and he was not happy with it. And I think that's it's the democratic process. We have gone to great pains to explain ourselves. And I feel good that most of our members understand it and either support us or don't oppose us. I mean, there's a lot of people who really don't pay that much attention, but they don't oppose us. And I think the issue of our newsletter that I'm probably most proud of was in 2006. Which was the first heated round of wind debate in Vermont. We were getting ready for a board meeting and the board members were there and we were all talking and I realized that almost all of them had on their own initiative, gone and visited a large wind project somewhere else and in the community and talked to people and listened to the noise and all of that. So we devoted almost all of an issue of our newsletter to, we asked them to write just personal accounts of their trips to Ridgeline in Tennessee, upstate New York, which has a lot of wind, New Zealand, and it was very personal and individual, and I bring that into when I testified a few weeks ago about the moratorium in the Vermont Senate. I brought a copy of that in and gave it to them all, because it's like we've been talking about this longer than you have, folks, and I really wanted to show that our board members had taken the time to actually, not drive by, but visit communities and ask people who live there how they, what they thought about living near wind turbines.
So when people in Washington Electric, certainly when people get passionate about an issue like, when you're talking about all the way back to Seabrook and the dissident sort of campaigns within the co-op. How frequently does the co-op have competitive elections? Is it sort of a common thing? Is it every once in a while? How does that work in your co-op?
It's every once in a while, and I mentioned in the 80s, and there was an earlier round in the 70s of hotly contested, really two factions struggling for control and changing the direction of the co-op. In more recent years, we don't have contested elections that much. We usually do if there's a vacancy, if an incumbent is not running for re-election. People are very for a co-op, and particularly an electric co-op where you join by virtue of where your house is. If you want electricity, you have to be a member of the co-op, and it's our job to then explain what that means to people who may or may not really have cared. They just needed, they needed to open an account with the utility. So I think it's actually a sign that people are generally supportive of how we're running the co-op, both from a policy level as well as, the management and keeping the lights on. That we see contested races when an incumbent announces ahead of time that they're not going to be seeking re-election. People are very, I've mentioned this before we went on air here, we have a newsletter that goes out 10 times a year, and we survey our members about every 5 years, and one of the questions we always ask them is, do you read the damn newsletter? And 60% say they read all or most of it, and people stop me whenever an issue comes out. People are stopping me on the street talking to me about something they read in the newsletter. To me, that says people are very aware and engaged and understand that it's a co-op, and if they're not storming the board meetings or insisting on running a dissident campaign, it means that the majority, or the great majority anyway, think it's okay.
So, I guess one question I have then is, thinking about both Washington Electric Co-op, but also electric co-ops in general. What do you see the nature of the relationship between electric co-ops and the larger co-op movement? What is for you? What is that?
There is a real connection. You mentioned earlier VSECU before you started talking to me. We've had a relationship with them as well. First of all, I'm a member of that credit union, which I joined when I was a state employee, and when membership was still limited by employment and certain other organizations. But when they first started expanding their membership before they went to general geographic, one of the things we worked out with them was an agreement that a membership in Washington Electric Co-op or employment at the co-op made you eligible to be a VCECU member. That kind of went away when they said, well, anyone who lives in Washington County, in Orange County, anyone that lives in the state of Vermont can be a member. That didn't have that same meaning. But we have also had relations with them around energy efficiency programs, and we also offer that same solar hot water with the same vendor as the Energy Co-op of Vermont. So we've had a relationship with them. We also, little things like when we have our annual meeting, we do door prizes. We pull numbers out. And we get our door prizes from Hunger Mountain Co-op and from Cabot. We just make a point of, that's who we go hit up for a prize. And we write about, in Co-op month in October, we always do something about co-ops that's not about electric co-ops. So we try to make that connection, and with credit unions in particular, I think we really have, in a few ways, encouraged people to check them out. There's a couple of years where we, in October, did a sort of an article and a sidebar box listing all of the credit unions in our area that people could join, so as not to advertise one over the other.
Going back to sort of the democratic culture and keeping members informed, you mentioned that in addition to the annual meetings and the newsletters, Washington Electric started having sort of other meetings throughout the year in various geographic places.
Yes, we have in October actually. Each year we pick 2 towns in different parts of our community that are kind of central to an area in their state, and we do a dinner meeting. We ask a local organization to do the dinner, and so that's a benefit for a local organization, so sometimes a school or a nonprofit or something. And so people get together for dinner in a meeting place somewhere in the town, and then we have a program that's very informal where a few of the management staff will pick a couple of hot topics for that year and do a brief presentation, but really talk to, answer any questions that anybody wants to talk about. Wind has come up at several of those. And also, during dinner and after the meeting, the members buttonhole us about, it could be about big stuff or about whether we're doing a good enough job in their area trimming the trees, or whatever. So we have people around who can talk about any of that stuff. That's been very, we started doing that about 8 or 9 years ago, maybe a little more now. And that's been working out very nicely. And what we do, because we're so kind of far-flung, with both that and our annual meetings, we use our newsletter. That becomes the feature story in the next issue, with pictures that if you weren't there, you could have been there. That's part of the message. First of all, this is what we talked about, and this is questions we got, and this is what we said. But we really want to reinforce that whether you dragged yourself out when you got home from work or not to go to the meeting, you could have. People you may know went there, and that I have felt very strongly that that's almost as important as voting and being there is if people really understand that it's a co-op and they can go, they have the opportunity. If it's an uncontested race and the ballot gets lost under a pile on their kitchen table, that's all right. But they know they can vote, and if there was an issue, they'd probably pay a little more attention to make sure they voted.
So we've got just a couple minutes left in the show, but I know it was announced recently that you're planning on retiring from the co-op.
I'm planning on retiring at the end of June.
Yep. So what's next for the co-op, and what's next for you?
The board is in the process of looking for a new manager, and I'm staying out of that, at least for the time being. In terms of me, I have told people that I don't golf and I don't have any hobbies, so I think that I will continue working at something. Probably, I think I've been between 16 years at the co-op and 10 before that in state government. I don't want to be a manager anymore. That's part of my retirement. I think I'll work on policy and communications and just hire myself out for probably less than part-time.
Cool. Well, thank you so much for coming on the program. It's been really great to get your stories and perspective on this.
Yep.
So we'll be coming back in 2 weeks with, I believe, an interview with Julia. Is it Julia Curry who's coming up next? Or?
Co-op Power.
Oh, okay, yeah.
Yes, that's the next episode. Yeah.
So
Co-op Power, Southern Vermont.
We'll be experimenting with some new technology, trying to do a remote interview via Skype, which fingers crossed the technology works well. But I think it should be an interview. Do you want to give a little preview about kind of what they're?
Well, Co-op Power is sort of a branch of an organization that extends into New York and Massachusetts, and they're really sort of focusing on small-scale solar projects mostly, and having sort of the benefits of those projects accumulate and flow back to membership, as well as sort of spawn more projects. So it's an interesting story.
Cool. So yeah, we will be we'll be back in 2 weeks with that story and some co-op news. But until then, I'm Matthew Cropp.
And I'm Eric Davis.
Thanks for watching Cooperative Vermont. Good night.